Captain Marcus Thornfield had served the royal family of Eldoria for 15 years. He had witnessed coronations, state funerals, and diplomatic crises that could topple kingdoms. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what Princess Isabella would reveal on that cold October evening. As he stood frozen in the marble hallway of Rosewood Palace, the princess's words echoing in his mind, he realized that everything he thought he knew about the royal family was about to crumble. The secret she had uncovered about Queen Consort Victoria's eldest son would not only shake the very foundations of the monarchy, but would force him to choose between his sworn duty and his moral compass. In the shadows of ancient tapestries and beneath the gaze of painted ancestors, a truth so devastating was about to emerge that it would change the course of Eldorian history forever. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Rosewood Palace as Captain Marcus Thornfield made his evening rounds through the East Wing. The palace corridors, usually bustling with servants and courtiers during the day, now lay in peaceful silence broken only by the soft echo of his leather boots against the polished marble floors. Gas lamps flickered in their ornate holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls adorned with portraits of kings and queens who had ruled Eldoria for over 3 centuries. Marcus had always found comfort in these quiet evening hours. At 38, he was the youngest captain of the Royal Guard in the palace's history, having earned his position through unwavering dedication and an incident 5 years prior where he had saved King Edmund's life during an assassination attempt. The scar running along his left temple served as a permanent reminder of that harrowing night and the trust it had earned him within the royal family. As he approached the library wing, Marcus noticed a faint light emanating from beneath the heavy oak doors of the private study. This was unusual, as the family typically retired to their quarters by this hour. He paused, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his ceremonial sword. Years of training had taught him to investigate any deviation from normal routine, no matter how minor it might seem. Soft voices drifted from within the study, and Marcus recognized the melodious tone of Princess Isabella, King Edmund's youngest daughter. At 22, she was known throughout the kingdom for her sharp intellect and fierce independence, traits that often put her at odds with the traditional expectations of royal protocol. Unlike her older siblings, Isabella had chosen to pursue studies in law and political science, much to the chagrin of Queen Consort Victoria, who believed such pursuits were unsuitable for a princess. Marcus approached the door with careful steps, not intending to eavesdrop, but concerned for the princess's safety. The palace had been on heightened security since rumors of political unrest in the neighboring kingdom of Astoria had reached their borders. Through a slight gap where the door hadn't been fully closed, he could see Princess Isabella seated at the massive mahogany desk, surrounded by scattered papers and leather-bound ledgers. "These numbers don't match," Isabella murmured to herself, her brow furrowed in concentration as she compared documents by lamplight. Her auburn hair, usually perfectly arranged for court appearances, fell loosely around her shoulders, and she had traded her formal gowns for a simple white blouse and dark skirt that allowed her greater freedom of movement. Marcus was about to announce his presence when Isabella suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at a particular document. The color drained from her face, and she leaned back in her chair as if the paper had physically struck her. Her green eyes, so much like her father's, widened with what appeared to be shock and disbelief. "This cannot be true," she whispered, her voice trembling as she reached for another ledger with shaking hands. "Please, let this be some sort of mistake." The urgency in her voice concerned Marcus deeply. Princess Isabella was known for her composure and rational thinking, rarely showing such emotional distress. He watched as she frantically searched through more documents, her movements becoming increasingly frantic as she cross-referenced various papers and financial records. For nearly an hour, Marcus remained at his post, torn between his duty to continue his rounds and his growing concern for the princess's well-being. The lamp in the study burned lower, casting longer shadows across the room as Isabella continued her investigation with determined intensity. Occasionally, she would pause to wipe tears from her eyes or take deep, steadying breaths before returning to her work. Finally, as the palace clock chimed 11 times, Isabella gathered specific documents into a neat pile and secured them with a ribbon. She stood slowly, as if the weight of what she had discovered had physically aged her in the span of those few hours. Marcus stepped back into the shadows as she approached the door, not wanting to startle her or reveal that he had been nearby. Princess Isabella emerged from the study with the bundle of papers clutched tightly to her chest. Her usual confident stride had been replaced by uncertain, hesitant steps, and Marcus noticed that her hands continued to shake as she locked the study door with a heavy brass key. She glanced around the corridor nervously before heading toward the main staircase that led to the royal apartments. As she passed near Marcus's concealed position, he heard her whisper to herself, "How could Alexander do such a thing? How could Victoria allow this to continue?" The mention of Queen Consort Victoria's son Alexander, heir to the throne, sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Alexander was known throughout the kingdom as a future king who embodied honor and justice, beloved by the people and respected by foreign dignitaries. Marcus waited until Isabella's footsteps faded completely before emerging from the shadows. His mind raced with questions about what the princess had discovered in those documents, and why the mention of Prince Alexander had caused her such obvious distress. The loyalty he had sworn to the royal family included protecting them from external threats. But what happened when the threat might come from within their own ranks? The remainder of his rounds passed in a blur as Marcus grappled with the implications of what he had witnessed. Princess Isabella had clearly uncovered something significant related to Prince Alexander, something that had shaken her to her very core. The financial documents she had been examining suggested some form of monetary impropriety, but Marcus couldn't fathom what the heir to the throne could possibly be involved in that would warrant such secrecy. As he completed his patrol and prepared to hand over duties to the night watch, Marcus made a decision that would prove to change everything. Instead of retiring to his quarters as usual, he decided to investigate further. His position as captain of the guard granted him access to most areas of the palace, and his concern for the royal family's well-being justified a closer examination of recent events. The palace archives were located in the basement levels, accessible through a series of stone corridors that had been carved out during the palace's original construction 3 centuries ago. Marcus retrieved a lantern and made his way down the narrow spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing eerily in the confined space. The archives contained decades of financial records, correspondence, and official documents related to the running of both the palace and the kingdom's affairs. Marcus began with the most recent financial ledgers, focusing on any entries related to Prince Alexander's activities and expenditures. As heir to the throne, Alexander received a substantial allowance from the royal treasury, funds that were supposed to be used for official duties, charitable works, and maintaining his household. The initial entries appeared routine: payments for staff salaries, maintenance of his private residence, contributions to various charitable organizations, and expenses related to his official engagements. However, as Marcus delved deeper into the records, he began to notice irregularities that matched the concern he had seen in Princess Isabella's behavior. Large sums of money were being withdrawn from Alexander's accounts with increasing frequency, but the purposes listed for these withdrawals were vague and difficult to verify. Entries such as diplomatic expenses, security consultations, and private investments appeared regularly, but without the detailed documentation that typically accompanied royal expenditures. What troubled Marcus most was the pattern he began to recognize in these transactions. The amounts were growing larger over time, and they were being withdrawn just before major political events or important royal decisions. It was as if someone was using advanced knowledge of royal activities for personal gain, or worse, was being paid to influence outcomes that should have been determined solely by the crown's judgment. As dawn approached, and the first hints of sunlight began to filter through the small basement windows, Marcus realized that Princess Isabella had likely uncovered evidence of the same financial irregularities that now concerned him. The implications were staggering. If Prince Alexander was indeed involved in some form of corruption or inappropriate financial activity, it would not only destroy his reputation, but could destabilize the entire monarchy. Marcus carefully returned all documents to their proper places and made his way back to his quarters, his mind heavy with the burden of knowledge he wasn't sure he was prepared to carry. As captain of the royal guard, his primary duty was to protect the royal family from harm. But what was he supposed to do when the harm might be coming from within their own ranks? The revelation that Princess Isabella had made this discovery first provided him with some comfort, knowing that someone within the family was aware of the situation, but it also raised new questions about what actions she might take with such dangerous information. The following morning brought an unseasonably warm October day to Eldoria, with golden sunlight streaming through the palace windows and birds singing in the royal gardens. Despite the pleasant weather, Marcus found himself unable to shake the heavy feeling that had settled over him since his discovery in the archives. He dressed carefully in his formal uniform, the deep blue fabric adorned with gold braiding and the royal crest embroidered on the chest, preparing for what he knew would be a challenging day. The morning briefing with his fellow guards proceeded normally, with routine reports about overnight security, upcoming royal engagements, and maintenance issues throughout the palace grounds. Marcus found it difficult to concentrate on these mundane matters when his mind kept returning to the financial irregularities he had uncovered and Princess Isabella's obvious distress from the previous evening. After dismissing his team to their various posts, Marcus made his way to the main palace to begin his supervisory duties. The royal family typically gathered for breakfast in the small dining room adjacent to their private apartments, a more intimate setting than the grand banquet hall used for formal occasions. As he approached the dining area to conduct his routine security check, Marcus could hear animated conversation coming from within. Through the partially open door, he observed the royal family engaged in what appeared to be a tense discussion. King Edmund sat at the head of the table, his weathered face showing the strain of his 63 years and the weight of ruling a kingdom through increasingly complex political times. His thick gray hair was perfectly groomed despite the early hour, and he wore a simple but elegant brown suit appropriate for a day of administrative duties. Queen Consort Victoria occupied the seat to his right, her posture as rigid and formal as always. At 55, she maintained the elegant beauty that had first caught the king's attention 25 years earlier when she had arrived at court as a foreign diplomat's daughter. However, the years had added a steely quality to her blue eyes and a sharpness to her voice that made even seasoned courtiers uncomfortable during private audiences. Prince Alexander sat across from his stepmother, and Marcus was struck by how different the future king appeared from his usual confident demeanor. At 28, Alexander possessed the classic good looks expected of royalty, with dark hair, strong features, and the tall, athletic build of someone who had received the finest education in both academics and physical training. This morning, however, his usual easy smile was absent, and he seemed to be choosing his words very carefully as he responded to questions from his father. Princess Isabella occupied the seat furthest from the others, and Marcus noted immediately that she appeared to have slept very little. Her face was pale, dark circles shadowed her green eyes, and she picked absently at her breakfast while watching the conversation with obvious tension. The bundle of documents Marcus had seen her collect from the study was nowhere visible, but her frequent glances toward Prince Alexander suggested that their contents weighed heavily on her mind. The representatives from the Merchants Guild are expecting a response to their proposal by the end of the week, King Edmund was saying, his deep voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Alexander, you've been reviewing their recommendations for the new trade agreements. What are your thoughts on the proposed changes to import duties? Prince Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his seat before responding. The proposal has merit, father, but I think we need to consider the long-term implications more carefully. Perhaps we should delay our response until we can conduct a more thorough analysis of how these changes might affect our relationship with neighboring kingdoms. Marcus found this response curious, as Prince Alexander was typically decisive and well-prepared when discussing political matters. The heir to the throne had spent years studying economics and international relations, and he usually provided detailed, confident assessments of policy proposals. This hesitant, almost evasive answer was completely out of character. Queen Consort Victoria placed her teacup down with enough force to make it rattle against the saucer, her displeasure evident in the sharp sound. Alexander, you've had over a month to review this proposal. The guild representatives have traveled from 3 different provinces to attend next week's meeting. We cannot continue to postpone important decisions indefinitely. I agree with Victoria, King Edmund added, his tone suggesting growing impatience. The kingdom's economic stability depends on maintaining good relationships with our trading partners. If we appear indecisive or unreliable, it could damage our reputation in ways that take years to repair. Princess Isabella suddenly looked up from her untouched breakfast, her green eyes flashing with an emotion that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Perhaps Alexander has good reasons for wanting to delay this decision, she said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that made everyone at the table pause. Sometimes additional time reveals important factors that weren't initially apparent. The silence that followed her comment was thick with tension, and Marcus observed as meaningful glances passed between family members. Prince Alexander's face had gone noticeably pale, while Queen Consort Victoria's expression hardened into one of barely controlled anger. King Edmund looked confused by the undercurrents in the conversation, his eyes moving from one family member to another as he tried to understand what was really being discussed. "Isabella," Victoria said carefully, her voice taking on the tone she typically used when addressing subordinates who had overstepped their boundaries. "I'm sure your brother has perfectly reasonable explanations for his caution. However, the responsibilities of future kingship sometimes require making difficult decisions even when all information isn't available." Marcus watched as Princess Isabella's jaw tightened at her stepmother's condescending tone. The relationship between Isabella and Queen Consort Victoria had always been strained, partly due to Isabella's resistance to traditional royal expectations, and partly due to what many courtiers whispered was Victoria's favoritism toward her own son over her stepchildren. "You're absolutely right, Victoria," Isabella replied, her voice maintaining perfect politeness while her eyes conveyed a much different message. "The responsibilities of royalty do require making difficult decisions. Sometimes those decisions involve confronting uncomfortable truths, even when they affect people we care about." Prince Alexander's fork clattered against his plate as he set it down abruptly. "Isabella, perhaps we could discuss whatever's troubling you privately after breakfast. Family meals aren't the appropriate venue for cryptic conversations." The suggestion seemed reasonable on the surface, but Marcus noted the underlying tension in Alexander's voice and the way his hands seemed to tremble slightly as he reached for his water glass. Whatever Princess Isabella had discovered in those documents was clearly affecting her brother deeply, confirming Marcus's growing suspicion that the financial irregularities were not merely clerical errors. King Edmund cleared his throat, a signal that usually indicated his desire to move past uncomfortable topics. "I think we've discussed the trade proposal sufficiently for now. Alexander, please prepare a preliminary response for my review by Thursday. We can finalize the details before meeting with the guild representatives." As the family began to disperse from the breakfast table, Marcus stepped back to avoid being seen observing their private conversation. However, he couldn't help but notice that Princess Isabella remained seated while the others prepared to leave. When Queen Consort Victoria approached her stepdaughter, presumably to offer some parting comment, Isabella looked up with an expression that was both determined and slightly defiant. "Victoria," Isabella said quietly, but clearly, "I think it would be beneficial for all of us if certain family matters were addressed honestly and openly. Secrets have a way of becoming much more damaging when they're allowed to fester in darkness." The Queen Consort's face went through a series of subtle changes, from confusion to concern to what appeared to be genuine alarm. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, dear, but if there's something specific troubling you, perhaps we should discuss it privately." "Perhaps we should," Isabella agreed, standing gracefully and smoothing her blue morning dress. "Though I suspect that private discussions haven't been entirely effective in resolving certain ongoing situations. Sometimes more direct action becomes necessary." Marcus retreated further into the corridor as the conversation ended, and family members began leaving the dining room. The implications of what he had overheard were deeply troubling, suggesting that Princess Isabella was prepared to confront Prince Alexander and Queen Consort Victoria about whatever she had discovered. The potential for scandal and political damage was enormous, particularly if the princess's evidence revealed actual wrongdoing rather than simple financial mismanagement. Throughout the remainder of the morning, Marcus observed increased activity in various parts of the palace that suggested something significant was developing. Servants moved with unusual urgency through the corridors, several courtiers engaged in hushed conversations that ended abruptly when others approached, and there seemed to be an underlying tension among the staff that indicated they sensed something important was happening within the royal family. Marcus decided to position himself strategically near the areas where he believed Princess Isabella might attempt to confront her brother or stepmother. His duties as captain of the Royal Guard included protecting family members from threats, but he was beginning to realize that the greatest threat to the monarchy's stability might come from revelations about Prince Alexander's activities rather than from any external enemy. Around midday, Marcus noticed Princess Isabella making her way toward Prince Alexander's private study, the same bundle of documents tucked under her arm that he had seen her collect the previous evening. Her determined stride and the set of her shoulders suggested that she had made a decision about how to proceed with whatever evidence she had gathered. Marcus positioned himself in an alcove near the study where he could observe without being detected, his concern for both siblings' well-being overriding any qualms about monitoring their private conversation. As captain of the Royal Guard, he had witnessed many family disagreements over the years, but the current situation felt different, charged with implications that could affect not just the individuals involved, but the entire kingdom's future. Princess Isabella knocked firmly on the study door, and Marcus heard Prince Alexander's voice invite her to enter. The heavy oak door closed behind her with a definitive sound that seemed to echo through the corridor, and Marcus settled in to wait for what he suspected would be a conversation that would change everything he thought he knew about the royal family he had sworn to protect. The tension in Prince Alexander's study was palpable as Princess Isabella entered, carrying herself with the dignity and determination that had become her trademark among the palace staff. The room itself reflected Alexander's personality perfectly, elegant, but not ostentatious, with rich mahogany furniture, leather-bound books lining the walls, and a large window overlooking the palace gardens where autumn flowers still bloomed despite the season's advancing chill. Prince Alexander rose from behind his desk as his sister entered, his usual warm smile notably absent. The strain of the morning's breakfast conversation was evident in the tight lines around his eyes, and the way his hands moved restlessly, adjusting papers and straightening objects that were already perfectly arranged. Despite his obvious nervousness, he maintained the dignified bearing expected of the future king of Eldoria. "Isabella," he said, his voice carefully controlled but lacking its usual warmth. "I'm glad you decided to speak with me privately. Your comments at breakfast were rather concerning, and I think we need to clear the air about whatever's troubling you." Princess Isabella moved to the center of the room, placing the bundle of documents on a small table near the window where the afternoon light could illuminate them clearly. Her green eyes, so much like their father's, were serious and determined as she regarded her brother with what appeared to be a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Alexander," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "I've discovered something that I wish I could ignore, but my conscience won't allow me to remain silent. The documents I found last night reveal activities that compromise not only your integrity as future king, but potentially the stability of our entire kingdom." Prince Alexander's facade of calm began to crack as he observed the official-looking papers his sister had brought with her. His face grew noticeably paler, and he moved away from his desk to lean against the window frame, as if needing physical support for what was to come. "I'm not sure what you think you've found," he said carefully, "but I hope you'll allow me to explain any discrepancies or misunderstandings before drawing conclusions that could damage our family irreparably." Isabella untied the ribbon binding the documents and spread several papers across the table's surface. Marcus, positioned outside the study, could hear the rustle of paper and the measured cadence of Isabella's voice as she began to present her evidence, though he couldn't make out her exact words. The princess's tone was methodical and precise, suggesting that she had carefully organized her findings for maximum clarity and impact. "These financial records show a pattern of transactions that began approximately 18 months ago," Isabella explained, pointing to specific entries on the ledgers. "Large sums of money flowing into accounts controlled by you, Alexander, from sources that are not part of your official royal allowance or any legitimate business ventures I can identify." Prince Alexander approached the table reluctantly, his hands clasped behind his back as he examined the documents his sister had assembled. Marcus could see through the window that the future king's expression grew increasingly troubled as he recognized the papers and understood the implications of what Isabella had uncovered. Furthermore, Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction, "The timing of these payments corresponds directly with several major royal decisions that have had significant economic impact. The approval of the Northern Mining Consortium's expansion, the selection of contractors for the new harbor construction project, the granting of exclusive trading rights to the Westfield Merchant Association. Each of these decisions was preceded by substantial payments to your accounts." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the ticking of the ornate clock on Alexander's mantelpiece. Marcus found himself holding his breath as he waited for the prince's response, knowing that what happened next would determine not only the future of the royal family, but potentially the fate of the entire kingdom. "Isabella," Alexander said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "you don't understand the complexities of the situation. These arrangements weren't made for personal gain. They were necessary to secure the kingdom's economic stability during a very uncertain period. Princess Isabella's expression shifted from disappointment to something approaching anger as she processed her brother's attempt to justify what appeared to be clear corruption. Economic stability, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. You accepted bribes to influence royal decisions that should have been made solely based on what was best for our people. How is that providing stability? Prince Alexander moved to his desk and sank into his chair, suddenly, looking much older than his 28 years. The confident bearing that usually characterized the heir to the throne had been replaced by the posture of someone who realized that his carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. The payments weren't bribes, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. They were consulting fees for advice and expertise I provided to various business organizations. Everything was documented properly, and no laws were technically broken. Isabella gathered one of the documents from the table and held it up for her brother to see clearly. This payment of 50,000 gold pieces came from the Northern Mining Consortium 3 days before Father signed the expansion approval that you personally recommended. The documentation you mentioned describes it as consultation on geological survey interpretation, but you have no training or expertise in geology, Alexander. You couldn't interpret a geological survey if your life depended on it. The accuracy and thoroughness of Isabella's investigation was becoming apparent to both her brother and to Marcus, who was beginning to understand the full scope of what the princess had uncovered. This wasn't a case of simple financial mismanagement or questionable judgment. It was systematic corruption that had been ongoing for over a year. Prince Alexander stood abruptly and began pacing behind his desk, his hands running through his hair as he struggled to find some way to defend his actions. You don't understand the pressures I've been under, he said, his voice taking on a desperate quality. Father expects me to be involved in every major decision, to provide insight and recommendations on matters that affect the entire kingdom. These consulting arrangements gave me access to information and expertise that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Access to information, Isabella repeated slowly, her voice heavy with disbelief. Alexander, you sold your influence as future king to private interests. You compromised your integrity and betrayed the trust of our people for money that you didn't even need. Marcus could hear movement from within the study, suggesting that one or both of the siblings was walking around the room as their conversation continued. The emotional weight of the discussion was evident in their voices, even though he couldn't see their expressions or body language from his position in the corridor. It wasn't supposed to continue for so long, Alexander said, his admission confirming what Isabella had already proven with her documentary evidence. The first payment was supposed to be a one-time arrangement, just to help resolve a complex situation involving the harbor construction contracts. But once it started, it became increasingly difficult to stop without revealing what had already happened. Princess Isabella's response came after a long pause, during which Marcus imagined she was processing the full implications of her brother's confession. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness that was more devastating than anger would have been. Alexander, you're going to be king someday. Our people trust that you'll make decisions based on their welfare, not based on which private interests are willing to pay you for favorable treatment. How can you possibly rule with integrity when you've already proven that your judgment can be purchased? The truth of Isabella's words seemed to hit Prince Alexander with physical force. Marcus could hear the sound of a chair being pushed back forcefully, followed by footsteps moving rapidly around the room. The future king was clearly struggling with the reality of what his actions meant for his ability to rule effectively. What do you want me to do? Alexander asked finally, his voice carrying a note of desperation. The money has already been accepted. The decisions have already been made. I can't undo what's already happened, and revealing it now would destroy not just my reputation, but the entire monarchy's credibility. Isabella's response was immediate and unwavering. You have to tell Father. You have to confess what you've done and accept responsibility for your actions. The longer this remains hidden, the more damage it will cause when it inevitably comes to light. And if I refuse? Alexander asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The silence that followed was filled with tension so thick that Marcus could feel it even from his position outside the study. When Princess Isabella finally responded, her voice carried the weight of someone who had made an incredibly difficult decision. Then, I'll tell him myself, Alexander. I love you as my brother, but I love our kingdom and our people more. I won't be complicit in covering up corruption, even to protect someone I care about. Marcus realized at that moment that he was witnessing a turning point not just for the royal family, but for the entire kingdom of Eldoria. Princess Isabella's ultimatum would force Prince Alexander to choose between personal preservation and accepting responsibility for his actions, a choice that would determine whether the monarchy could survive the scandal with its integrity intact. The sound of papers being shuffled came from within the study, followed by what sounded like Alexander collapsing back into his chair. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible, but Marcus could detect the resignation of someone who had finally accepted the inevitable consequences of his choices. "How long do I have to make this decision?" Alexander asked. "Until tomorrow morning," Isabella replied firmly. "Father has a right to know the truth before he meets with any more representatives who might be involved in similar arrangements. If you haven't told him by then, I will." The remainder of that day passed with agonizing slowness for everyone involved in the unfolding drama at Rosewood Palace. Marcus found himself in the impossible position of knowing about a crisis that could destroy the monarchy while being unable to act on that knowledge without violating his duty to respect the royal family's privacy. As captain of the Royal Guard, his primary responsibility was to protect the crown from threats, but the greatest threat now seemed to be emerging from within the royal family itself. Throughout the afternoon, Marcus observed subtle changes in the palace's atmosphere that suggested others were beginning to sense that something significant was developing. Servants moved through their duties with unusual efficiency, as if trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves, while courtiers and administrative staff engaged in whispered conversations that ceased whenever members of the royal family appeared. Prince Alexander spent most of the afternoon secluded in his study, occasionally summoning various advisors for private meetings that lasted only a few minutes each. Marcus noted that these consultations appeared to be ending abruptly, with the advisors leaving looking confused or concerned. It seemed that the future king was seeking counsel, but finding it difficult to reveal enough information to receive meaningful guidance without exposing his compromised position. Princess Isabella, meanwhile, had retreated to her own chambers, where she remained for several hours. Marcus positioned trusted guards near her quarters, not out of concern for her physical safety, but because he understood that she now possessed information that could destabilize the kingdom. If word of Alexander's corruption leaked before the matter was resolved internally, the political consequences could be catastrophic. As evening approached, Marcus received word that Queen Consort Victoria had requested a private meeting with Princess Isabella. This development concerned him greatly, as he suspected that Victoria was aware of her son's activities and might attempt to convince Isabella to remain silent about what she had discovered. The Queen Consort's protective instincts regarding Alexander were well known throughout the palace, and she had previously demonstrated her willingness to use her influence to shield her son from potential consequences. The meeting took place in Victoria's private sitting room, an elegantly appointed space that reflected her refined tastes and attention to detail. Heavy brocade curtains in deep burgundy framed tall windows, while delicate porcelain figurines and fresh flowers added touches of beauty to the room's sophisticated atmosphere. Marcus positioned himself in an adjacent corridor where he could observe the entrance to the sitting room without being detected. When Princess Isabella arrived for the meeting, her bearing remained dignified despite the obvious emotional strain she had endured throughout the day. She wore a simple but elegant evening dress in navy blue, and her auburn hair was arranged in a style that emphasized her determined expression. The bundle of incriminating documents was no longer with her, suggesting that she had secured them safely in her own quarters. Queen Consort Victoria received her stepdaughter with the formal courtesy that typically characterized their interactions, though Marcus could detect an underlying tension in her movements and expression. Victoria had always been beautiful in a classic, aristocratic way, but this evening her usual composure seemed forced, and there was a brittleness to her smile that suggested she was struggling to maintain her customary control. "Isabella, dear," Victoria began as they settled into facing chairs near the fireplace. "I've been concerned about you since this morning's breakfast. You seem troubled by something, and I thought perhaps we should discuss whatever is weighing on your mind." Princess Isabella regarded her stepmother carefully before responding, her green eyes alert and wary. "Thank you for your concern, Victoria. I've indeed been dealing with some disturbing information that affects our entire family. I believe you may already be aware of the situation I'm referring to." Victoria's carefully maintained expression flickered momentarily, revealing a flash of what might have been fear or anger before she regained her composure. "I'm afraid I don't know what situation you mean, dear. Perhaps you could be more specific about what's troubling you." The formality of their conversation masked an underlying battle of wills, with each woman carefully choosing her words while trying to determine how much the other knew. Marcus found himself impressed by Princess Isabella's composure as she faced down her stepmother, a woman known for her ability to intimidate even experienced courtiers. "I'm referring to Alexander's financial arrangements with various business interests," Isabella said directly, abandoning any pretense of dancing around the issue. "The payments he's received in exchange for influencing royal decisions, the corruption that's been ongoing for over 18 months. I know you're aware of these activities, Victoria, because some of the payments were processed through accounts that require your authorization." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Marcus watched as Queen Consort Victoria's mask of innocent concern finally slipped completely. Her blue eyes hardened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to getting her way through intimidation. "Isabella, you're making very serious allegations without understanding the complexities of the situation. The arrangements you're referring to were carefully structured business relationships designed to benefit the kingdom's economic interests. There was nothing improper or illegal about Alexander's consulting activities." Princess Isabella leaned forward in her chair, her own voice taking on a steely quality that Marcus had rarely heard from the usually diplomatic princess. "Victoria, I've examined the documentation thoroughly. These weren't legitimate business relationships. They were bribes, pure and simple. Alexander sold his influence as future king, and you helped facilitate those transactions." The gloves were now completely off, and Marcus realized he was witnessing a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of Prince Alexander but also Queen Consort Victoria's position within the royal family. If Isabella's allegations were accurate, Victoria's complicity in her son's corruption made her equally culpable for the damage done to the monarchy's integrity. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly as her careful control began to slip. "The political and economic pressures facing this kingdom are more complex than you can possibly understand from your academic studies. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made to ensure stability and prosperity for our people." Isabella's response was immediate and unflinching. "Stability built on corruption isn't stability at all, Victoria. It's a foundation of sand that will inevitably collapse, taking everything else down with it. The people of Eldoria deserve leaders who make decisions based on principle, not on who's willing to pay the highest price for favorable treatment." Marcus could hear the passion in Isabella's voice as she defended the integrity of the monarchy and the welfare of the kingdom's citizens. Her words carried the conviction of someone who truly believed in the responsibility that came with royal privilege, a stark contrast to the pragmatic cynicism that seemed to characterize Victoria's worldview. "You're being naive, Isabella," Victoria replied, her tone becoming more condescending as she attempted to regain control of the conversation. "The world of politics requires compromises and practical arrangements that idealistic young people often fail to appreciate. Alexander was protecting the kingdom's interests by ensuring that important economic decisions were made with the best possible information and guidance. The Queen Consort's attempt to reframe corruption as pragmatic governance seemed to anger Princess Isabella even more than the original revelation of wrongdoing had. When she responded, her voice carried an authority that reminded Marcus of King Edmund at his most decisive. "Victoria, I'm not a naive young woman who can be dismissed with condescending explanations. I'm a member of this royal family with a responsibility to protect the integrity of the crown. What Alexander did, with your knowledge and assistance, was wrong. It was a betrayal of the trust our people place in us, and it cannot continue." The confrontation reached a critical moment as both women stared at each other across the elegant sitting room, each representing a different vision of how the monarchy should function. Victoria embodied the old-school approach of maintaining power through any means necessary, while Isabella represented a newer generation that believed in transparency and ethical governance. "What exactly do you intend to do with this information?" Victoria asked finally, her voice carefully controlled but unable to hide her underlying concern about Isabella's intentions. Princess Isabella stood gracefully, smoothing her dress as she prepared to leave the meeting that had resolved nothing but had clarified the battle lines for what was to come. "I've given Alexander until tomorrow morning to confess to Father. If he chooses not to take responsibility for his actions, I'll present the evidence myself. I won't allow this corruption to continue, regardless of the family relationships involved." Victoria rose as well, her face flushed with anger and what appeared to be desperation. Isabella, you have no idea what you're threatening to destroy. If this information becomes public, it won't just affect Alexander. It will damage the entire monarchy's credibility. Foreign kingdoms will see us as weak and corrupt. Our own nobles will question the crown's authority, and the political stability we've worked so hard to maintain will be shattered. The Queen Consort's warning contained legitimate concerns about the potential consequences of revealing Alexander's corruption, but Princess Isabella seemed prepared for these arguments. Her response demonstrated that she had thought carefully about all possible outcomes before deciding to confront the situation. The monarchy's credibility is already damaged, Victoria, Isabella said firmly. The only question is whether we address this crisis honestly and work to rebuild trust with our people, or whether we continue living a lie until the truth inevitably emerges in a way that we can't control. I believe in our family's ability to survive this scandal if we handle it with integrity and transparency. As Princess Isabella moved toward the door, Queen Consort Victoria made one final attempt to change her stepdaughter's mind. Isabella, please consider the impact this will have on your father. He's worked his entire reign to build a strong, stable kingdom. Learning that his heir has compromised the monarchy's integrity will devastate him, possibly enough to affect his health and ability to continue ruling effectively. The appeal to Isabella's love for her father was Victoria's strongest argument, and Marcus could see that it affected the princess deeply. For a moment, her determined expression wavered as she considered the personal cost of revealing the truth to King Edmund. However, when she responded, her voice remained steady and resolved. My father deserves to know the truth, Victoria. He's strong enough to handle this crisis and wise enough to find a way forward that preserves what's most important about our monarchy. Protecting him from difficult truths isn't kindness. It's a betrayal of his intelligence and his right to make informed decisions about our kingdom's future. With that final statement, Princess Isabella left Queen Consort Victoria's sitting room, leaving behind a woman whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Marcus retreated to his own position as Isabella passed, but not before noting the grim determination in her expression and the way she walked with the purposeful stride of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. The final night before Princess Isabella's ultimatum expired passed slowly for everyone within Rosewood Palace. Marcus found himself unable to sleep, his mind occupied with the knowledge that the morning would bring either a voluntary confession from Prince Alexander or a forced revelation that would shake the monarchy to its foundations. As captain of the Royal Guard, he had prepared for many types of crises, but never one that originated within the royal family itself. Dawn brought gray skies and a cold wind that rattled the palace windows, as if nature itself sensed the approaching storm. Marcus began his morning duties with extra attention to security protocols, knowing that the day's events might create situations that required careful management to prevent information from reaching unauthorized ears. The last thing the monarchy needed was for rumors of corruption to spread throughout the kingdom before the situation could be addressed properly. King Edmund maintained his usual schedule, appearing for breakfast in the small dining room at precisely 7 o'clock. The monarch showed no signs of awareness that his family was facing its greatest crisis in decades, instead focusing on his normal routine of reviewing overnight dispatches and preparing for the day's administrative duties. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the tension that Marcus could sense building throughout the palace. Prince Alexander arrived for breakfast several minutes late, his appearance suggesting that he had slept little and was struggling with the weight of his impending decision. The future king's usually perfect grooming was slightly disheveled, his formal attire wrinkled as if he had dressed hastily, and dark circles under his eyes spoke to the emotional toll of the past 24 hours. Despite his obvious distress, he attempted to maintain his customary dignified bearing as he took his place at the family table. Queen Consort Victoria entered the dining room with her characteristic poise intact, but Marcus noted subtle signs of strain in her carefully controlled expression. Her makeup was applied more heavily than usual, possibly to conceal evidence of a sleepless night, and her movements were slightly more rigid than normal, suggesting the effort required to maintain her composure. The elegant burgundy dress she wore was perfectly appropriate for a day of royal duties, but it could not disguise the tension that radiated from her posture. Princess Isabella was the last to arrive, and her appearance immediately drew the attention of everyone present. She wore a simple but elegant black dress that seemed to reflect the gravity of the situation she was prepared to address. Her auburn hair was arranged in a severe style that emphasized the determination in her green eyes, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. The breakfast conversation was stilted and uncomfortable, with long silences punctuating attempts at normal family interaction. King Edmund seemed puzzled by the strange atmosphere, but chose not to comment directly on the obvious tension among his family members. Prince Alexander barely touched his food, instead moving items around his plate while stealing occasional glances at his sister. Queen Consort Victoria maintained perfect table manners while watching Isabella with barely concealed apprehension. As the meal neared its conclusion, Princess Isabella set down her teacup with deliberate precision and looked directly at her brother. "Alexander," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. "I believe you have something important to discuss with father." The simple statement carried the weight of the ultimatum she had delivered, and Marcus could see its impact on everyone at the table. Prince Alexander's face went pale as he realized that the moment of decision had arrived. Queen Consort Victoria's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, revealing a flash of panic before she regained control. King Edmund looked from one family member to another, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but uncertain about its nature. Prince Alexander opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, apparently struggling to find the words that would begin his confession. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece and the distant sounds of palace servants going about their morning duties. Finally, when it became clear that her brother was unable to find the courage to speak, Princess Isabella took a deep breath and turned to address her father directly. "Father," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, "I've discovered information about financial arrangements that compromise the integrity of our family and potentially damage the monarchy's credibility." King Edmund set down his newspaper and gave his daughter his complete attention, his weathered face showing the alert concentration of someone who recognized the seriousness of the moment. "What kind of financial arrangements, Isabella? Please be specific about your concerns." Marcus watched as Princess Isabella reached into a small bag beside her chair and withdrew several documents that he recognized as part of the evidence she had gathered. Her movements were deliberate and careful as she placed the papers on the table where her father could see them clearly. "These are records showing payments totaling over 200,000 gold pieces that Alexander has received from various business interests over the past 18 months, Isabella explained, her voice growing stronger as she presented her case. The payments were made in exchange for Alexander's influence in securing favorable royal decisions on matters such as mining rights, construction contracts, and trading privileges. The impact of this revelation on King Edmund was immediate and devastating. The monarch's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and, finally, a profound sadness that seemed to age him visibly in the span of moments. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the documents Isabella had provided, and Marcus could see the weight of betrayal settling over the man who had dedicated his life to ruling with integrity. "Alexander," King Edmund said quietly, his voice carrying a note of desperate hope that his daughter might be mistaken, "please tell me that these allegations are not true. Please tell me that you haven't compromised your position as heir to the throne for personal financial gain." Prince Alexander finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Father, I can explain. The situation is more complex than it appears, and my intentions were never to betray the trust you've placed in me." The attempt at explanation fell far short of the denial that King Edmund had hoped to hear, and the monarch's expression shifted from desperate hope to crushing disappointment. "So it is true," he said, the words seeming to physically pain him as he spoke them. "My son, my heir, has been selling royal influence to private interests." Queen Consort Victoria finally spoke, her voice carrying a defensive tone as she attempted to minimize the significance of what had been revealed. "Edmund, you must understand that the payments Alexander received were legitimate consulting fees for expertise he provided to various business organizations. The timing of certain royal decisions was coincidental, not the result of any improper influence." Princess Isabella's response was immediate and forceful. "Victoria, that explanation is contradicted by the documentary evidence. The payments were clearly tied to specific royal decisions, and they were processed through accounts that you helped establish and manage. Your involvement makes you equally responsible for this corruption." The revelation of Queen Consort Victoria's complicity hit King Edmund like a second blow, and Marcus could see the monarch struggling to process the full scope of the betrayal within his own family. The man who had ruled Eldoria for over 2 decades with wisdom and integrity was confronting evidence that the 2 people closest to him had systematically corrupted the very institution he had devoted his life to protecting. "Victoria," King Edmund said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Did you know about these arrangements? Did you help facilitate payments that compromised our family's integrity?" The Queen Consort's carefully constructed defense crumbled under the direct questioning from her husband. "Edmund, I was only trying to protect Alexander's interests and ensure that he had access to the resources and information necessary to prepare for his future role as king. I never intended for the arrangements to continue for so long or to become as extensive as they did." The admission of guilt was devastating in its implications, confirming that the corruption had not been a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated strategy involving multiple members of the royal family. Marcus realized that he was witnessing the potential destruction of everything the monarchy represented to the people of Eldoria. King Edmund stood slowly from his chair, his movements reflecting the weight of the crisis that had suddenly engulfed his family and kingdom. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a ruler who had made difficult decisions throughout his reign, but also the pain of a father confronting his son's betrayal. "Alexander," he said formally, "you will immediately cease all contact with any business interests that have provided payments to you. You will prepare a complete accounting of all money received and all decisions that may have been influenced by these arrangements. Most importantly, you will begin the process of making restitution to our kingdom for the damage your actions have caused." Prince Alexander nodded wordlessly, his face reflecting the shame and regret that had been building since his sister's initial confrontation. The future king, who had once carried himself with confidence and dignity, was now a broken figure facing the consequences of choices that had seemed manageable when they were hidden in secrecy. "Victoria," King Edmund continued, his tone even more formal as he addressed his wife, "your involvement in facilitating these arrangements has compromised your position within this family and this kingdom. We will discuss the implications of your actions privately, but I want you to understand that the trust between us has been severely damaged." Marcus observed the complete transformation of the royal family dynamic as the truth emerged and consequences began to take shape. The breakfast that had begun with uncomfortable tension had ended with revelations that would require months or possibly years to address fully. Princess Isabella, having fulfilled her difficult duty of exposing the corruption, now showed the emotional cost of her decision. Tears glistened in her green eyes as she watched her family struggle with the crisis she had been forced to reveal. "Father," she said softly, "I'm sorry that I had to be the one to bring this information to light, but I couldn't allow the corruption to continue. Our kingdom and our people deserve better from their royal family." King Edmund moved to his daughter and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his expression showing both pride in her courage and sadness about the necessity of her actions. "Isabella, you did what was right, even though it was difficult and painful. Your loyalty to the kingdom's welfare over family convenience shows the kind of integrity that will be essential for rebuilding trust in our monarchy." Marcus stepped back from his observation position as the family meeting concluded, knowing that his role as protector of the royal family now extended to helping manage the complex process of addressing the scandal while maintaining the kingdom's stability. The revelation of Prince Alexander's corruption and Queen Consort Victoria's complicity would require careful handling to prevent political chaos and preserve the monarchy's fundamental legitimacy. As the immediate crisis of disclosure passed, Marcus realized that his duties as captain of the Royal Guard were about to become more challenging than ever before. Protecting the royal family now meant not only defending them from external threats, but also helping them navigate the consequences of internal betrayal while rebuilding the trust and integrity that formed the foundation of their right to rule Eldoria. The morning that had begun with an ultimatum had ended with the exposure of a scandal that would reshape the monarchy forever, but also with the hope that truth and accountability might ultimately prove stronger than corruption and secrecy.